Morning, evening, afternoon to everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us for this webinar on applying the digital principles for social protection. My name is Veronica Wolczak. I'm social protection policy specialist at ILO headquarters in Geneva. And it's a pleasure to co-host this webinar with socialprotection.org, the digital convergence initiatives and other partners. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. This is an interactive session and you're welcome to come in and join when you feel you would like to contribute to the conversation. If you would like to do so, please raise your hand, and when you speak and you want to, we welcome you to open the camera also. And then if you're not speaking, please make sure to mute yourself and also switch your camera off again. This session will be recorded, so we hope this will be fine with everyone. And with this, just a quick overview of what we're going to cover. I will do a quick welcome and introduction of the objectives of the webinar. And then we will have an opportunity to look at some of the digital investment principles in more detail. And we have a range of highly interesting and qualified experts to join us for this discussion of a series of principles before we wrap up. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So before we start to discuss the substance, just a quick word on who we are, the Digital Convergence Initiative. So this is a joint effort under the Partnership for Universal Social Protection, USP 2030. Members of this initiative are government representatives, development partners, private sector, NGOs, social protection, academics, and practitioners from around the world. And the objective of the initiative is really to contribute to creating harmonized and interoperable digital ecosystems for social protection. And of course, I mean, a key aspect of this is to ensure interoperability. This is certainly consensus across the digital and social protection communities. And for interoperability to work well, you need standards. And this is what the convergence, what we want to converge around. So standards for IT solutions. And this will enable interoperability, which in turn will reduce the time and cost for developing solutions. It will make sure that processes are more user-friendly and more practical at the back end. It will ensure flexibility to adapt to change and to evolve over time and to use different solutions and avoid vendor lock-in. And so this is what the digital convergence initiative hopes to drive forward. Next slide, please. So as one part of the activity, the Digital Convergence Initiative supported this work on digital investment principles and their application more specifically to the social protection sector. Why is this important? Over the past decades or longer, we've seen a real buzz around digital solutions. But we've seen early experiences with this in the social protection sectors, sometimes created more problems than solutions. And there is risks when embarking on digital projects to reproduce or even enlarge exclusion. There is a risk to adopt inappropriate solutions that are not working in a specific country context. There is sometimes lack of administrative capacity or weak infrastructure that needs to be taken into account. There's not sometimes weak digital literacy or huge digital inequalities. The data situation may be poor. There may not be a strong governance framework. So there's a lot of different contexts and challenges, and recognizing these difficulties, there was also a realization that we really need a good understanding of what are key principles or key rules to follow when developing digital solutions for social protection, if we want them to really work, to really extend, to really contribute to the extension of social security and social protection, if we want them to be secure and to be fit for purpose. And so we didn't start from scratch. I mean, social protection is not the only sector that is now looking into developing digital solutions. And there is already a strong set of principles for digital development out there. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. We just looked at the existing principles and thought through carefully what does this look like when we apply these principles to the social protection sector. Next slide, please. So our starting point were the 9 guidelines designed to help development practitioners integrate best practice into technology-enabled programs. These are the principles for digital development stewarded by DIAL, and this was created jointly through a community of practice. And as I said already, we're going to look into more detail during today's webinar on 4 of these principles, but there are 9 overall. So I'm just going to say a few things about the 5 principles that we won't have an opportunity to look at in so much detail today, just for time reasons. Of course, all of them are important, and only if the full set of the 9 principles are respected to the extent possible, we can be sure to have sound design and implementation of digital projects. So the first principle, design with user. For the social protection sector, this means user means both the administrative staff in the back office using the digital solutions, but user, of course, also means the end beneficiary of a social protection scheme and program. And it is important that any digital solutions developed really fit the needs of both these users. And it depends a lot on the context and the specific project or digital solution to be worked on, how this design with the user could look like. But clearly, it is important to ensure that both the administrative staff and the beneficiary views come into play, and they both feel comfortable, because otherwise the adoption of those digital solutions will not work. The second principle that I'm just jumping to, being data driven, because the other 3 we will actually look at in the second part of this webinar. Be data driven. This is a call for making sure that decisions are taken on the grounds of data. And in particular for social protection policy makers, it is important that political decisions are informed by evidence and data. And this is important because very often when designing digital solutions in the social protection sector, this of course makes a lot of sense, their primarily concern is, of course, to make the implementation process work. But it is important in the design to also already think about monitoring and evaluation needs and possible data that you would want to have available for future adaptation of the system or the scheme or the program, and tracking progress or impact. So having said all that, it is important in terms of being data driven that the relevant data is available to the right people when it is needed to inform decisions. And while technology, of course, cannot provide solutions in terms of to political questions of who gets what, when, and how, it is important to use technology to inform this political decision-making process. The next principle that I just want to say 2-3 words on is the one on open standards, open data, open source, and open innovation. which is a mouthful, and it's, I mean, the four really need to be looked at separately, and I mean, we don't have much time now to discuss them in detail, but it's clear that the large investments in digital solutions are only justifiable if they can be widely used, and this is only the case if they are not locked behind licensing agreement, and can only be used by specific institutions. So clearly, open solutions are more efficient because they allow for that economy of scale that really justifies making the investment in the first place. This openness also avoids duplication, and it facilitates very much the other principle that we're going to discuss today, which is reuse and improve, so building on what already exists. In the social protection sector, we see that for example, open source solutions are only now emerging. So in general, open source solutions for public administration are just starting up. We don't have that many examples in our sector yet to draw on, but there are some interesting examples, and it is certainly a way that is starting to be more and more explored. On open data, on the contrary, there are more examples, or there are many examples where, but I mean, more so from high and upper middle income countries, where data is provided by the public administration on specific schemes or programs or on progress overall. Of course, open data here it needs to be balanced also with the principle of privacy, but some sort of data is often made available to the public to see how the system performs, or how certain schemes and programs perform, how many beneficiaries are receiving how many benefits, etc., etc. And this creates transparency, accountability. It generates public support for a scheme or program, and so that, I mean, this is also important from a governance perspective. Then, I mean, the last two, I think they're a bit no-brainers, address privacy and security and be collaborative. I mean, this is, I think, clearly two principles where consensus is easily reached. Still, it's easier said than done. On addressing privacy and security, I just would like to mention that we are also, over the next couple of weeks, going to launch a report precisely on this question of providing guidance on how to ensure confidentiality of private information in the design and implementation of social protection systems. So watch out for our forthcoming publication. This, of course, is enormously important as social protection schemes and programs are administered by public agents. They need to really make sure they can fully respect privacy and ensure data security, especially since social protection schemes and programs tend to collect a large amount of personal private data that should really be kept confidential. And this is important to keep in mind when collecting, storing, and using the data. So throughout, they need a strong regulatory framework and data governance framework needs to be put in place. And of course, the big challenge here is also that in many countries, the regulatory framework often lags behind the technical developments. So we see technology and digital solutions take a headway, and then the regulatory agents trying to build the legal frameworks following up behind these more rapid technological developments. But there are, again, internationally agreed principles with regard to minimizing the amount of data collected in the first place, informed consent, security, etc. And all of these principles are discussed in detail in the forthcoming publication that I mentioned. And the final principle on being collaborative, I mean, it goes without saying that all the other principles actually only really work and can be properly followed through if the overall spirit is one of being collaborative. In the social protection sector, this is even more so the case because social protection is inherently multi-sectoral. In each country, you will have to work across different ministries, different sectors, different institutions, including Ministry of Labor, Health, Education, Agriculture, but also the Ministry of Finance, etc. And if each scheme or program starts building siloed digital initiatives, it is impossible to reap the potential benefits that can be gained from digital solutions. And only if collaboration takes place across actors and joint interoperable solutions are built, we can achieve the objective of universal social protection that the international community committed to. Next slide. And with this, I think I have one more slide to go. So just in terms of a little bit of background. So with this webinar, we are launching a digital consultation process on this short report that we prepared on applying the digital investment principles to the social protection sector. This was an initiative launched following the constitution of the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board Working Group on Digital Social Protection in 2020. The report was developed throughout 2021 based on a desk review and a series of expert interviews. Following the launch of the Digital Convergence initiative in 2021, this has now converged with the SPIAG working group. And today we are here now to present some of the findings that we have in the report and to launch this consultation process. So following this webinar, all of you are cordially invited over the next 3 weeks to take a look at the report and provide comments, inputs, further suggestions, and feedback on this report. And we will then incorporate the comments that we receive and finalize this publication, hopefully for launching it in the final version in July 2022. Next slide. And with this, I hand over to Madhumita, who will take us through the remainder of our discussion.
Thanks, Veronica, for setting up the stage for what promises to be a lively discussion today. Hi, everyone. My name is Madhumita Hebar. I'm a digital social protection specialist supporting the DCI. As Veronica mentioned, we will be releasing this draft guidance for open feedback later today. As the primary author of this draft, I can say that the draft has raised many different perspectives and debates. So it's really nice to have this platform to discuss some of these issues with colleagues old and new as we finalize the guidance. The last thing we want to do today is to cause death by a traditional webinar. So what we are hoping to do is to facilitate some candid conversations around what constitutes good digital social protection. So we'll have 3 rounds of conversations today. You'll see what I mean in a minute. We've put together an initial panel of 2 to 3 participants to get the conversation going. They are what we call the fishbowl. Some of you may be familiar with fishbowl conversations. In each round, in addition to the 2 to 3 initial participants we've invited, we'd also like to invite 1 or 2 people from the audience to raise their hand to join this fishbowl. Of course, if you are shy fishers, we totally understand, and you want to comment away in chat, please feel free to do so. Fernanda, next slide, please. Yeah, so as Veronica mentioned, we are going to be zooming in on 4 principles today. The first is understand the existing ecosystem. The second round would focus on building for scale and sustainability. We've combined them because there are many overlapping themes. And we would end with a panel on reuse and improve. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is the original digital principles text. I won't go into that. I think in the chat box a few minutes ago, Fernanda had kindly pasted the link to a digital principles primer. You could also take a look at that to get more details on how the principle is worded. Next slide, please. So what we did through the consultation process last year, mainly in the form of interviews and desk review, is to identify what could the implementation of this principle in social protection sector look like. And on this slide, there are some of the key aspects of the ecosystem that are important to understand while designing digital solutions in the social protection sector. The different elements are there for you to see, and I don't want to go into too much detail because it's best we get the conversation started. But what I want to highlight is a recurrent challenge that emerges in applying these actions we've identified is how fluid the ecosystem is. You might design for what currently exists, only for it to either rapidly or gradually evolve, sort of affecting the relevance of your solution as things change. And this is an aspect that I want to focus on with colleagues who are here today. As a reminder, feel free to join at any point in the discussion by raising your hand. My colleague Dominic is monitoring the show of hands on Zoom, and he will draw my attention to it. And if you're speaking for the first time, do introduce yourself with your name, role, and affiliation. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have some comfortable but virtual chairs for the session today for you. And at first, I want to invite Thomas Gabriel to share his opinion. In countries where the availability of infrastructure and skills is quite low, designing explicitly for it may lock the country into limiting technologies in the future. So how do you avoid it? And this was a very recurrent theme throughout the guidance prepared by us. Thomas, you've been designing social protection information systems in extremely limited capacity settings, such as Haiti, South Sudan, and Lesotho in recent years. What's your take on this?
All right, thank you, Madhumita. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, thank you.
So right, in limited, where there is limited skills, there also happens to be limited funding. And limited skills, we also have to break down into limited understanding as well, unfortunately, at all levels. And so it's a very difficult situation to be in when there is little understanding in terms of what these systems could provide, and how you go about designing, and implementing them. So in terms of the the first aspect to really understand is the ecosystem and the feasibility. What is the feasibility of the desired digital solution, and to be very clear on what is feasible given the ecosystem, given the existing situation and the context, and to be very clear with the stakeholders on what's feasible in maybe the shorter term versus the midterm versus the longer term, because it is a very rapidly changing situation, and digital solutions are getting easier. Tools such as ODK and others are now, within arm's reach of a lot of organizations. In terms of the infrastructure, limited infrastructures, there are solutions such as cloud-based infrastructures, but that has to be weighed against legislation. In some of the countries I work, there are, let's say, laws against using the cloud. Things have to be in kind of government-based facilities, hosted facilities. So it makes it a little bit complicated to propose cloud-based solutions, which need, in my opinion, less capacity than if you were installing it locally. But there's a trade-off. The risk is that if it's not properly implemented, installed, and supported, it runs a greater risk of being lost. And we saw that in situations such as BVI, where the hurricane wiped out the data center, and everything was lost. So you have to balance that, of course, the limited skills, limited infrastructure with legislation, which says, you know, we need to have it hosted and installed here, with risks of it being completely lost, or even more, or even less secure because of the limited skills and being able to properly secure the infrastructure. In terms of the challenges in lack of skills and capacity, if you will, to me, what you need to do, the solution there is to look for a trusted partner, a private entity, UN entity. If you're the government, you need to rely on a trusted entity who understands this subject, and they should be someone with proven experience in the country or in the region. And there's a lot of players that you know, come to the table, but you should be really looking for trusted entities with experience. If you internally, as a government, or don't have that capacity, which means it's more expensive, sure. But I think, you know, and I mentioned the lack of finances in these situations is often the case. We have very small social development units within ministries. What's interesting, if you scratch below the surface, you find that the Premier's office is doing similar work, and the Parliament is doing similar work. And so there is money there, and maybe what needs to happen, or at least one of the ways of scratching that surface there is to prove that you can do it as a small unit, and then to seek to demonstrate that, prove that you're a trusted entity, and you can support this sort of work, so that the other ministries will then increase your portfolio. So these are the ways I think that we try to address them in countries or in territories that have some limits in terms of technology, in terms of capacity, and in terms of finances.
Thanks, Thomas. It's interesting to hear you say trade-offs and careful weighing of risks, because that's a theme that comes up again and again. And I want to sort of piggyback on that and give Rodrigo, who's here, to tell us a bit about how these trade-offs have been made in the case of a more advanced country. Rodrigo, you come from decades of leading IT initiatives in Brazil, including DataPrev, which handles information services and technology for the Brazilian social welfare system. And now you're also at ILO advising countries that may be far less advanced than Brazil. Can you tell us a bit about how these trade-offs are made and how they could potentially evolve to avoid some of the risks that Thomas was just mentioning?
Sure. Not only the trade-offs we got right, but sometimes the ones we got wrong. I'll give you a good example that feeds into some of the other debates we might have. In 2003, when I first joined the federal government, there was a big discussion about intensifying the use of open source software in the federal government of Brazil. But for several reasons, the people involved in this divided themselves in those that wanted to heavily use office suites, open source office suites, to substitute the desktop operating systems and the office productivity suites for open source software, involving hundreds of thousands of desktops, involving hundreds of thousands of public servants. And other people who wanted to use open source software only in the IT, the heavy IT systems, the heavy IT industry around government. And then you have very significant trade-offs. What the first group was wanting was a demonstrative effect. And of course, where they started doing this, they kind of created chaos, because 200,000 people changing their operating systems, which means basically that the button that I've always pressed that was always on the right-hand side of the screen now is on the left-hand side of the screen, and my world comes to end because of this. And all this noise, all this racket was really detrimental. And the other people, they weren't offering any showcases, they weren't offering any demonstration, but they were tackling more than 80% of the costs involved with licensing. They were tackling, so that's a good example of trade-offs. I'm not going to tell the story how it ended because it sometimes it gets ugly, but there you see, one people were saving very little amount of money because the systems were basically free, even the licensed ones, because they were used as a vendor lock-in case, but they were wanting to, change the lives of 200,000 public servants, while other people were doing with highly technical, highly specialized people, 5,000 people, but they were aiming at 80% of the very high budget that we're talking about. So these kinds of choices are what you need to be aware. There's merit in both sides of the equation. There were possibilities of success in both sides of the equation, but choices had to be made, because this whole discussion of digital development, it is not only a constant administration of the trade-offs you mentioned, but also a continuous journey, because as Thomas mentioned, the scenario, the environment will change. So you need to be flexible and be prepared to change. And that means building for things, or at least with the flexibility to be able to change because of elements that you haven't even understood yet, or elements that haven't even been created yet, or new technologies that are going to come. So when you have this long-term view of your projects and your environment, you really stress the flexibility of whatever you're building, whatever you're developing.
Thanks, Rodrigo. If I can ask a quick follow-up question to that. This idea of a long-term view keeps getting emphasized, right? Because you don't know what you don't know most often in the case of digital transformation initiatives. So was there a long-term roadmap in the case of Brazil, or did it sort of evolve organically in your case?
Well, Brazil is an early adopter. We went heavily into digitizing government work in the late 60s. So a huge amount of legacy systems to be dealt with. And that means that this long-term view was mostly imposed by some of these legacy systems reaching deadlocks, or reaching complete end-of-life failure, or even some level of vendor lock-in that made it completely unsustainable. I had to do a massive, really gigantic migration from the mainframe to lower platforms, because basically we were in a dead end, both technologically, but mostly due to blackmail by vendors that basically put their knives to our necks and demanded more and more money for less and less productivity. So yes, the scale, if you don't prepare for it, it will be imposed on you. And if you are not prepared and it is imposed, you'll end up by paying more and having a lot less success in your endeavors.
Sagely advised, Rodrigo. Thanks. I want to pick off on the open source aspect that you mentioned, and take this opportunity to invite Saurav to the table. Saurav, you've been engaging with countries on implementing OpenEMIS, which is a digital public code for social health protection delivery. And I know taking feasibility assessments to understand the ecosystem is a huge part of the country engagement. Can you give us some examples to tell us the risks of not undertaking such an engagement? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Madhumita. Yes, so without a feasibility assessment or any kind of a study to really understand ecosystems, as any digital public good, you're literally flying blind. And as software developers or as maintainers of a global good, when we just look at our software, we talk amongst ourselves who know the software, and we really have this good feeling that what we've designed is the best, and it's going to solve every problem that's out there that an MIS could ever have, and that's very rarely true. Very, very rarely. And because every country or every implementation situation within a country is different. There are so many factors at play. And so it is extremely important to understand the ecosystem. For example, when we were first starting out with OpenIMIS, trying to implement it in Nepal, OpenIMIS has served all the functionality that the health insurance required in Nepal. But as we started scratching the surface and really understanding what was there, we learned that the official calendar of Nepal is not the Gregorian calendar, and that there is a completely different date system used in the country, which was something that was never thought of when the software was developed, right? So so that took a lot of understanding, and without having that prior knowledge, if we had just tried to implement the software without really understanding these intricacies, it really leads to problems in the long run. Similarly, when we were working on a project for HIV care in Cameroon, the issues of anonymity were raised, where beneficiary data had to be completely anonymous, and we weren't allowed to share any data. But when undertaking feasibility studies, we figured out that there were other systems already doing this in terms of dealing with patient data. They had the necessary security provisions, they had the permissions from the government. So then instead of building that functionality into the OpenIMIS implementation, we started building interoperability with the system, with the other systems. So it really these feasibility studies and really trying to understand the ecosystem beyond just the tool, right? Because these days there's not going to be a case where you're just going to implement one digital public good or one software as standalone. It is going to be connected to so many different systems, from payment systems to beneficiary systems to identification systems. There's so many. So and that makes it even more important to really be a part of the ecosystem, understand the ecosystem, and see how you fit as a part of the puzzle rather than just being a solution put in there.
Thanks, Saurav. It's great to see some examples of how cultural norms, practices, and existing initiatives are all important things to understand as a part of the assessment. Before I move on to the next session, I quickly want to give 2 minutes for some audience reactions. I see Rodolfo has his hand up. Rodolfo, do you want to come in with any reactions?
Yes. Thank you, Madhumita. Super interesting. No, I basically want to go back to the issue of lack of capacity that Thomas raised at the beginning. No, I mean, this is of course key. And I was thinking, how do we deal with this issue of lack of capacity? No, and we face this in many countries. No, and so there are a number of strategies that we implement, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. But we need to think about more consciously. No, first, showing results. No, and we're talking about results like the end results, like for example, okay, we'll incorporate this technology, and in the end, it's gonna improve program efficiency, and then it's gonna reduce poverty. But then we also know that governments, and in particular ministries of finance, are interested in savings and efficiency in those terms. So showing results. Then the issue of consensus and buy-in of key decision makers. No, and we have to work on influencing those key decision makers. And then the issue of funding and partnerships that Thomas was raising. Of course, a driver of this limited capacity in many countries is lack of funding, and also sometimes partnerships, in particular with private sector, can help kind of improving the capacity. No, but in the end, also for us working globally, what this means in terms of showing results, consensus, buy-in, and so on, means that we need to have a really good knowledge of the system and of the environment, of the ecosystem, going back to ecosystem, really good knowledge, and a long-term engagement. No? Sometimes we just go with a one-year project, and we expect that in 1 year, we're gonna change substantially the capacity to deliver these complex systems. No? So longer-term engagement is also important. Anyway, I just wanted to share that. The chair looked very comfortable, so I wanted to take the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodolfo. Thanks for being our conscience keeper at this event, reminding us of all the things we sometimes get wrong. And the issue on partnerships you mentioned is very interesting to me personally, because I'm from India, and one way the government has managed to scale up a lot of the national digital assets is through private sector partnerships, but it can be a double-edged sword. But I will not take more time on that, and hopefully continue this conversation offline. With that, I think we can go to our next panel. Fernanda, if you can share the slides, please. Thank you. We can go to the next slide. So this is the main principle text. Without going into it too much, design for scale basically implies not becoming a victim of what's commonly known as pilotitis in the health sector, where small donor-funded pilot efforts are not designed to scale. A linked issue is, of course, sustainability, where resources don't exist beyond the scope of the donor project to maintain the solution. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I won't go through all of the actions again, but basically to emphasize that there's a lot of consensus among donor counterparts that these are important actions to take to build sustainable, scalable solutions, but there are credible challenges to implementing them. And we already touched upon a few of them in the previous panel. In our draft guidance, you'll also see some examples across Africa and Latin America where digital solutions were either abandoned or had to be rebuilt because many of these actions were not followed. So finance and capacity is a chicken and egg problem, right? In many cases, there's limited government funding and capacity, yet the pressure to demonstrate success immediately is quite real. So I would like to take the opportunity to invite some of the donor counterparts in today's session to reflect on a few of these aspects. And I want to start off with Abid, who has been supporting HOPE, UNICEF's humanitarian cash transfer management information system, which is also aspiring to be a digital public code. Abid, obviously, widespread adoption is key to the sustainability and scalability of a digital public code. So how have the elements of scale and sustainability been built into the design of HOPE? And what have been some of the challenges to do so as a very young open source solution, or to be open source solution? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So basically, the HOPE system, at the beginning, starting the designing that system, which started 4 years ago when the teams decided to have kind of a global system that supports the implementation, mainly the implementation of the cash programs and the emergencies. So basically, the design started with going to all the countries that they have a large scale programs implemented and they already have their own systems, just to learn and understand how to design and implement such a system at a larger scale levels and gain from this experience. So this was the first step for building that system. And then taking into consideration all the aspects of all the aspects needed in order to develop that system, starting from how we can ensure that this system can be scaled up, how we ensure that the system can be sustainable, etc., and what are the resources to be used, what are the let's say the language in order to develop that system. So basically, all of these things were taken into consideration and started the development of the system, taking into consideration that at a certain point, that system will be adopted by not 1 or 2 countries. It will be adopted by globally by all the UNICEF country offices and maybe by other NGOs, organizations that are working in emergencies, etc. And now the discussion is how we are going to make that as a digital public good to be used by not only by UNICEF but by other NGOs and by other organizations, and later on how the government can be adopting that system, etc. So highlighting that the design of the system adopted one thing, and one important thing is the integration with other existing systems, like in relation to registration or data import of the beneficiaries into the system, the payment modules, the information and the SMS dissemination, etc. So the design of the system and building of the system was based on integrating with other existing systems and working onto improving these existing systems by using it into other countries. And when we started deploying the HOPE system and these integrations with other systems, we started learning from other countries and the use of that system, what needs to be changed, what are the changes to be done on the system, what are the requirements of these countries, specifically when we are talking about specific countries, and apply these changes into the system in order to reach a point that, okay, now we can say that the system can change the state to be a digital public good and can be an open source and can be used by other countries, can be used by other programs, can be used by etc. The important thing that I would like to highlight here is one important thing is related to the interoperability of the system with other systems. So when we want to talk about, okay, we want the system to be a digital public good, can be used by whoever wants to use it, and to ensure that the system is serving the needs of the country or serving the needs of the program. So we want to ensure that the system is interoperable. So one, as I said before, I mean, the system is integrated with other systems, but as well, so we're working with other entities, with other organizations to ensure that interoperability with their existing systems. One, for example, for the deduplication of the data, and the second maybe for the modules that are existing, or for the programs that are existing in the country. So basically, we ensure that integration and that interoperability with the system. So in terms of the challenges that we are foreseeing, I mean, when it comes into the sustainability and the scalability of the program, I mean, I mean, more related to the sustainability of that system. So basically, thinking of having that as an open source, and now since UNICEF is putting the effort on keep developing the system, changing, putting the requirements, putting all the modules that are needed in order to have that system ready to be used whenever we want to use it in any situation or in any country. So basically, one important thing to highlight is the maintenance of that system, and then ensuring that whoever wants to take whatever the country that is going to include that system in their programs, so to ensure that we have the skills to ensure that we have to ensure the maintenance of the system, to ensure the budget that is existing there, in order to ensure that we have changing the system that can be adapted with the scale of the programs in the country, or the needs or the requirements in the country. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abid. Yes, indeed, the maintenance of these systems is a recurrent theme again in the draft guidance that we have produced. There is a lot of enthusiasm in the beginning, but as the requirements soar, so is the need for more long-term resources to be committed to something like this. which is a good point to jump off of to bring Julian to the table from the World Bank, who has been working in West Africa supporting governments build digital ID and social protection systems. Julian, can you tell us a bit about what you've been up to and how you're tackling issues of ensuring financing and staffing beyond the scope of a World Bank project in the countries you've been working on?
Yes, thank you so much, Madhumita. So I work on implementing ID systems in West African countries, primarily in Burkina Faso, but then also on social registries and G2P payment systems. So the key pillars of SP delivery systems. And the questions you ask about financing and staffing are incredibly difficult and incredibly key, obviously, to the question of sustainability. Let me start on financing. I mean, I think the first point on financing is that to obtain sustainable financing, independent of the source, is to have a good product or a good system that responds to actual needs. And so I think the first step is to get the value proposition right. And so I think there's a critical link to principle number 1 that we didn't get to discuss today about designing with the user to make sure that the system you're designing responds to an actual need by a user. And I think we need to define user broadly, because for example, in the case of social registries, we think of beneficiaries, but we also need to think of the programs that will be using the social registry, right? And I think here a mistake that we sometimes make is that we don't think of all the use cases from the get-go, but we omit, for example, insurance systems, health insurance systems are very much interested in social registry, but maybe not the most salient use case to begin with. And I think this is, as I said, particularly important for social registries, because I don't think there's an immediate revenue generating business model that comes to mind for social registries, but they do exist for some of the other systems. So in the case of ID systems, for example, I think that it could be considered. Obviously the risk of revenue generating business models is that can create exclusion, because you need somebody who pays for the systems, and you want to avoid that those are the vulnerable populations we're ultimately trying to serve. So in the context of the WURI program, so our West African initiative to put in place ID systems, foundational ID systems in 6 countries, we're advocating for a sort of a business model whereby private sector service providers pay for authentications on the ID system, but public sector service providers don't. And obviously the people who use the system to obtain proof of identity do not pay either, because, one of the key reasons why coverage of ID systems is so low in West Africa is because costs are often prohibitive to the end user. And then I think one of the things that we keep forgetting sometimes is the long-term cost. And the value proposition is very much based increasingly on data, and data is only valuable if it's up to date. And so as we build these systems, we need to keep in mind from the get-go, is the system still going to have an interesting value proposition that is worth being financed in a couple of years? And for social registries, I think we often make the mistake that we build systems, we collect data, and then 3 years down the road, the data isn't up to date anymore, and we don't have a means to pay for it. And so I think there's a lot of thinking to be done on the modular nature of data structures, so that we can piece together data, use interesting, innovative sources, and sort of a link to principle 6, I think, on open data standards, etc. And then let me briefly touch on staffing, because I think staffing is one of those things where we in the development space, we talk a lot about building local capacity, but I think it's one of those talking points that we don't always follow through on the ground, because I think it's, we're always behind, we're always late. So it's tempting to buy out of the box solutions where they exist, for example, in ID systems, or to bring in big consulting firms to put in place a system, and then building staffing and local capacity becomes a bit of an add-on. And we all know that that's not sustainable, because the system won't be as adapted to the needs on the ground. It will be difficult to maintain. There might be less local buy-in, etc. And so I think there's a few principles or sub-principles, I guess, that we need to keep in mind, and that we need to hold ourselves accountable to, which is we should prioritize sustainability over implementation speed, because I think taking shortcuts is more costly in the long run. We need to invest in local, but really need to prioritize investing in local technical and implementation capacity from the get-go. So in the case of WURI, we really tried to work with countries to build teams on the ground that are able to implement, supervise, and maintain these ID systems. In Burkina Faso, when we're in the conversation on the social registry, one of the first conversations we had with the government was staffing. Another sub-principle, I guess, is that we need to think about building local capacity and staffing from the get-go of the project. So from conception onwards, often it sort of comes at the tail end when it's really too late. And we need to link the conversations on staffing with financial sustainability, because obviously staffing is expensive. So these 2 points need to go hand in hand. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Julian. As you were speaking, I was thinking that the level of self-awareness in this small group here is quite high. So if we were to actually commit some thinking to it, we might come up with innovative solutions to tackle some of these challenges. I see Thomas and Rodrigo have their hand up, so I'll give you both maybe 2 minutes each to make some brief remarks. Maybe Rodrigo, you go first, and then Thomas. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. No, I think this also connects to the previous session. If you're talking about both building for scale as well as sustainability, you have to understand that your system is composed of different layers that have different time scales. Data, even though Julian is quite right about it being up to date, but the certain concepts of the data will remain the same for very long periods. A name is a name, an address is an address. The data that identifies relationship between employers and employees tend to stay the same. So these databases that we build, they will have a long lifespan, and they will constitute building blocks of a global or a national data infrastructure. So you can't contaminate this long-lived aspect of our systems with the business rules and the business transactions, which have a shorter lifespan. Going specifically for Social Security, for example, well, we have Social Security reforms like clockwork. It depends on the region. In Latin America, it's basically every 10 years. In other places, sometimes even faster, 5. So these, they alter the transaction rules, and the transaction rules must be modularly kept separate from the data. Otherwise, one need to change the transaction rules will obligate you to also change the database, and that impacts on your agility, your speed, and then everything becomes more costly. And then you have another layer, which is the interface, which is even faster. A few years ago, we didn't have any of these systems prepared for mobile. Now, if you don't have a system that deals with social protection without a mobile interface, then you are failing in your possibilities of reaching vast majority of people. So these, the separation in layers, separation in modules is also an element of building for scale. Going back, your database will probably, as it grows and you evolve, hopefully beyond the pilot phase, you will need more substantial data capacity, both for hosting as well as processing. Whilst your transaction might not be so demanded, then your interface, it's much more about the outreach and the agility of conversion than actually the churning of the data and the data processing. So if you manage to separate these things architecturally, you will have much more flexible, much more long-lasting, much more scalable products. So that is also an element where the technical aspects must coexist and understand these principles that we're talking about in terms of existing in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Rodrigo, for bringing our attention to the technical aspects of scale as well, quite important. Thomas, do you want to take 2 minutes now?
Yes, I want to speak to what Julian mentioned in terms of financial sustainability and give just an example of an issue we're dealing with in Haiti, where indeed the World Bank is involved. And there's an assessment being conducted on an MIS. The idea being that the ministry involved needs an MIS for their social development program, and they're comparing existing software solutions to building something from scratch. And the consulting entity that's doing this assessment is saying that they recommend using an existing system because it would save the government millions of dollars in development, because each of these systems that's being compared has been costed out at from 1 to, I think, 10 million in its development. So somehow the solution being proposed is, well, because it would cost you, government of Haiti, millions of dollars to develop this system, you should use something that already exists. And I would argue that if you're going to implement something that costs millions of dollars, then what are you buying into for the longer term? And why does it cost so much? And why can't you really do a proper costing assessment of a locally built solution where you're starting small and it can grow? So I think that sometimes, this idea of financial sustainability itself is a very complex question, and really needs to be dissected and understood. And yeah, I wanted to give that example from Haiti. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. This tension between should we build on what already exists, or should we customize something for ourselves, is quite real. And I take your point on assessing financial sustainability being quite complex, even as I was proposing that this is a key action in terms of assessing costs. As a part of the guidance, I was acutely aware of the weaknesses of existing methodologies, right? Indeed, we haven't seen very many methodologies that can accurately estimate costs when it comes to some of these digital systems being implemented in the social protection sector, except for some of the ones that have come up in the ID space. And perhaps there's something for us to learn from around developments there. But this is a good point for us to jump off of, because you mentioned building off of existing solutions or not, to the next principle, which is around reuse and improve. Next slide, please. So this basically shows the long principle text. As I said, we've shared the link if you would like to know more about it, but basically emphasizes reusing existing data, software, tools, standards, and systems. Next slide, please. So in the social protection sector, obviously the first thing to do is to identify existing technology, data, and standards that are relevant. And you can see some of the mapping that we did for open source solutions workshop that we did a few weeks ago now. And I know the initial tendency is to focus on open source solutions, but it's also good to emphasize at this point that standards, as well as existing shared services such as ID, payments, etc., are also equally important in the social protection space as countries move more and more towards integrated systems. The second thing to emphasize is that if you go for a modular approach, interoperable approach instead of standalone, then there'll be more opportunities in the future to take advantage of what already exists. Can we go to the next slide, please, so we can kick off some of the conversation? So first, I want to start talking about the use of existing data and systems to not hijack the conversation too much with discussions of open source. Shen Cheng from GIZ Cambodia is here with us. At the core of IDPOR, which is Cambodia's social registry, is the idea that social protection programs should reuse existing demographic and poverty data than collecting their own, which I understand is now even a legally backed requirement. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you have designed for the reuse of IDPOR by other user programs, what practical mechanisms are in place, and what has been the response of the user programs so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Mahumita, and hello, everyone. So regarding to the sharing and the using of the data from ID pool system, I think it's easy to group into three categories. First of all, it's about the technical part. So there are some common sentences that people speak out there. Software is eating the world. Then API is eating software. So of course, IDPO is on this trend to deploy API to share the valuable data that collected nationwide to the programs and ministries. Of course, the API is protected. Basically, we need to know who needs what and when to secure the data that quite sensitive as well for us. And regarding to protections, we use centralized authentication and authorization server, and it is also using the standard or a very common go-to system called Keycloak. Maybe we can talk about this in the other topic, but generally it's deployed OAuth, which is the open authentication for program to log in or for user to log in. So it's quite common that the other know about this as well. And we're also using the documentation for API. It's called Swagger, that the developer can test around learning from API with less learning. And we don't need to teach and train them every one by one for the API user. So basically, they just come as an online course, comprehends by themselves to whatever available in IDPO system.
Thanks.
And
yeah, please go ahead.
Yep, thank you. And also regarding to the data sharing, to make sure that the data is sharing to the right people and the right server. So we deploy the staging server, if you wish, you can call it sandbox, and the production system. Mainly the sandbox is for developer, and the production system, we only allow for server-to-server connections, which means that on the other side of the program or the administrator of the program can access, not developer or non-authorized user, so to speak. Then I move to the second point, is the procedure. Of course, the IDPO department or ministry would like to share the data because they feel it's important to reuse the data. But there is a probably small requirement that the one who want to access to the data needs to specify their legitimacy, whether they are from, which registration they got, what they need, and what purpose. And after some approval, then there is a NDA signed to make sure that they follow the procedure. For example, not sharing the data to third party because yeah, it's quite sensitive. And moving to the third point, besides deploy the technical aspect and the procedure, and there is also the collaborations aspect as well, that the IDPO is part of the National Social Protection Council, that they inform what is current and what is the future change of the IT system, so that the correspondent and the relevant partner or the API user know what's going to happen and prepare themselves accordingly. Also, that is a place that the IDPO resolve the technical blocking issues or even procedure issues as well. Sometimes when there is interoperability, the technical team meet each other, but there are some roadblocks, and then it is escalated, and the management team can come together and resolve the blocking issues. Yeah, so during this year, IDPO is joining CAMDX, or maybe internationally widely known as X-Road, data exchange platforms, to make sure that IDPO can share to all data users on a very standard that endorsed by the Cambodian government. The feedback that we receive from our API users, first of all, may be related to common practice, popular and standard platform that deploy in IDPO. So it is easier to make interoperability. Maybe in a way we say speaking the same language. What being done on the other side, it's also done on the ID pool side. It's just a matter of login and then pulling the data. Maybe in a little bit more specific term in technology, there is a JSON response that is part of a communication between API and OAuth or 2 for the login and authorization. Secondly, related to the reuse of the cloud platform, the system is more reliable and very few system downtime. Sometimes we need more RAM, or we need more processing power, or we need more disk space, so it can be scaled up and down easily without shutting down the server. Probably 1 or 2 seconds downtime, but this is much better than a few day downtime. And third, it also related to motivated individuals. In terms of support API user, when there is any issues or questions, the team on ID Pool came up quickly and then answer and support to make sure that there is no other roadblock on their side. For example, poor household comes to the hospital for medication, and then they now struggle to pay the money. So because there are some data issues, sometimes there is technical issue, then it creates some problem for the beneficiary. So this is where people rely and very inspired by ID Pool team, because the problem can be sorted out very quickly. Yep. That's it.
Can I just come in? For me, this is very heartening to hear, because when we produced this guidance about a year ago or more than that, I did speak to the ID Pool team, and the APIs were still being defined, and CAMDEX had still not come into the picture. So it's heartening to see the progress that has been made, and definitely ID Pool is something to follow for all of us here in the years to come, especially in the Asia Pacific region. Thanks for sharing that experience. And I will now quickly jump to Charlie on a different track. I just wanted to give some space to talk about existing data before we go to what I know is going to be slightly more controversial, is around the use of existing software and standards in the social protection sector. Before I come to you, Charlie, I see some very lively discussion happening in the chat around sustainability, and I encourage everybody else to participate there, should this be of interest to you. And we'll definitely make note of everything being discussed in our draft guidance. So Charlie, quickly coming to you now, you have been working on upgrading the SCTP MIS, the social cash transfer MIS in Malawi since 2020. And as a part of that effort, you did take a look at what resources existed in terms of software and standards. Can you tell us a bit about what your experience with that has been? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody from Lilongwe. My name's Charlie. I work at CGA Technologies, which is part of the Chorus International family that's led by Lutheran World Relief. Technology supported at scale development is what we do. As our name suggests, some of you will know us from having worked on the functional spec of HOPE a few years ago. Some of you will know us from the big South Sudan education data system, SAMS.org, that supported the tripling of enrollment there over the last 8 years. Since 2020, as Manmith said, we've been working for the Malawian Ministry of Gender with funding from KfW, supporting them both on the maintenance of the legacy MIS and the development of the so-called target MIS with the improved functionality there. I want to tell you about 3 things very quickly. First of all, what we have reused and improved. Secondly, how we have designed for reuse and for future-proofing. And then thirdly, to talk about the thing that I think sometimes people, get very worked up about, the reuse of code, but actually there's something much simpler that is very useful for reuse and interoperability, which is about taxonomies in English, all using a similar way to refer to similar phenomena or similar field definitions. So firstly, in terms of reuse, there's a cross-government national ID system. There's a cross-government unified beneficiary register here. Those exist, they're great. The social protection MIS ingests from the UBR, and then it handles the procedures that are specific to the social cash transfers program. In our design, what we've tried to do is to build on and align with the logic of the legacy system, which was built by our friends at IALA, now Sovereign, and also to align very much with the logic of HOPE, the UNICEF system. One, because we think it's good. Two, because that potentially sets you up for a future in which, situations where people have started in social protection programming with HOPE, there's then a way forward to a full dress, social protection MIS like this. And in practice, what we've done, I think, is quite closely aligned from what I can see from Richard's really helpful material from Uganda that he's recently published with what they've done there. We didn't find code that we could readily reuse that was available open, but we're going to help change that. So how we've designed for reuse and future-proofing, working with our government clients. The first thing to say here is the legacy system instantiated a specific process. That's what you do when you start out. I've got this job to do, I need this system to do it. As you go further along, you can start to think in kind of more general case terms. So the target MIS is designed as a general case system that can both deliver the existing process and has the functionality to handle any number of programs with any criteria, any payment mechanisms, any horizontal expansion, any vertical expansion, any number of expansions, any subset of citizens or indeed non-citizens. It's modularized to enable a smooth transition onto the target MIS and for future flexibility, and potentially when this comes to the end of it, goes to doggy heaven, then for a smooth transition off. It's got a secure Android app, so you can work offline from a phone if you're up country registering people, paying out, or whatever those might be. Those steps are necessary to future-proof because the Malawi social protection sector is a happening sector where lots of good stuff is occurring. And if you don't future-proof now, you'll get a surprise in a year's time when you need to do that in a hurry. So think hard now, design for general case, be future-proof, and then you will have smoother operation. But those things also make what we're doing relevant for wider use, potentially beyond Malawi. So when we develop code, as a technologies firm, we've got a team of 10 to 12 coders, the majority of whom are based here in Lilongwe. Great place if anybody wants to found a tech team. Great place, great talent, much cheaper than Nairobi and Lagos. We structure our development through GitHub, so multiple people can be working on the code at the same time, and they're pushing that up to GitHub. That means we can manage our work. It also means, if you make your repo open, that our counterparts in government can view the code as we go. And in fact, because we made the repo open, so can all of you. Manmeet is about to put the GitHub link in the chat. Brilliant timing. So you can have a look around as well. Now, for clarity, and a question I got asked by a very sensible official today, that's the code for the system. It's not obviously the local specific data, which needs to be fully secure and is and will be. So the first thing to say is it's there. Please go draw on it if you like it, and you've got the coders to customize it to the place that knock yourselves out. If you look at it and you think there are ways that we could do it better, please tell us. Or the things that we've missed, please tell us. We'd love to hear. There's an awful lot of intelligent thought in this virtual room, and we'll be very glad to have it, the benefit of it. Similarly, from our point of view, if you would like us in the next place to help us customize this to your context, very welcome to get in touch. And clearly, part of our judgment as consultants is that, one, we think this ought to be out there. It's been funded by a donor for the benefit of recipients for the use of a host country government in the global south. It'd be very strange if that were made proprietary. So if that intellectual capital were proprietary, it ought to be open, and we intend it to be so. We will likely seek DPG certification for it in due course, but we're in a hurry. The poor are in a hurry. So the code's there now. Please do look, and we'll get to the certification when we've got a minute. And this will start to be brought on, the target MIS will start to be brought on stream in the next few months. So you will find that there's still stuff that is being worked on in real time. That's fine. Building the plane as we fly is what we all need to do in this business. For one last kind of 30 seconds, I then want to turn to this point about taxonomy. We might hope to get to a situation in our sector, in social protection, a bit like that in the health sector, where DHIS2 is a kind of normative open platform. We might have a situation where there's a multiplicity of perfectly good social protection MISs that logically you'd hope would work in broadly consistent ways. But whichever way it goes, the first stage is going to be to have a common taxonomy. DHIS2 has that. Humanitarian sector has that humanitarian exchange language. 3IE have done that for interventions and outcomes. As far as I can see, I don't believe social protection yet has a normative taxonomy. And we were having a chat about this yesterday. And there are some more abstract definitions of fields out there in the World Bank Sourcebook and so on. But at this point, if you see what I mean, we don't even have a disagreement yet about taxonomy. We just have a void. And in a sense, probably what that requires is somebody to make a proposal that's very similar to the HXL postcard, just says, here's some suggested labels for core fields, hashtag this field, hashtag that field, etc., etc. And then gradually, as a community of practice, we will get there. That's it from me. I hope I haven't overrun my time. I just want to finish by saying enormous thank you to our ministry colleagues. We can do the coding, but fundamentally, the hard intellectual labor in working on a general case approach, rather than just saying, well, let's instantiate our existing process, is, that's done by the people who have to operate the thing. And we can help with that, but fundamentally, you got to have clients who want to do that intellectual lifting. And we're so grateful to have clients in the Malawian Ministry of Gender who absolutely do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm glad to hear you bring up the point of taxonomy, simply because, as Veronica says in comments, building consensus around taxonomy is one of the main agenda points of starting the Convergence initiative. So it's good to have our hopes and ambitions validated by someone who is actually working on this in a specific country. Thanks for that. I want to now bring attention to our final panelist for today. Richard Churcher from Development Pathways is here. He is no stranger to most people in this room, working across several countries in Africa and Asia on building SBMISs for the last decade. Richard, I wanted to ask you around building on what already exists, right? What is your view? Are there things currently in the space that SBMISs could potentially build upon? If not, why not? Or are there artifacts that are available, but there are real challenges to actually building on what already exists, which results to increased customization? Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Madhumita, and thanks, colleagues, for this opportunity. So I think that to begin with, reuse and improve practically means thinking through carefully the architecture of the information system that you're going to build. I think you're asking the question about, so what does it mean? There are quite a few number of global good tools that are out there. Why do countries go back to building things from the scratch? why don't you have a critical mass where we can say, well, we can build on, say, SCTP in, say, Malawi, or build on another system, say, in Zambia, or build on a system, say, in Uzbekistan, and any other part of the world. There are few critical barriers that typically need to be addressed if you have to really get the critical mass to get what is truly an information system that is open source for social protection. I recall way back in 2007, there was a big conference which was held here in Nairobi, sponsored by FCDO, and quite a number of other UN agencies also participated. There was a lot of excitement about we need to go open source. From here, we need to move forward, get some of the open source frameworks that had been built, and then replicate in a few countries. I recall there was a software which was built for a flagship Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya. It was customized a bit for a program in Zambia, but then that particular interest died. So I think, for me, let me just probably highlight a few key challenges that I think typically prevent these kinds of initiatives from moving forward. One key issue that people get concerned about significantly is data protection environment. So there's a young and growing data protection environment in many developing countries. In Europe, we have the GDPR. People want to know exactly the tool that they will likely adopt. Will it address, is it secure enough in terms of addressing the compliance with all the data protection challenges? That's the first issue. The other issue is the policy and legislative framework. So you can have, for example, an integrated system which is open source that deals with, say, for example, registration function, deals with, say, payments issues, but you can only achieve really the standardization in terms of the business processes. Taxonomy that Charlie was mentioning about. Once you have also in some countries some standardization in terms of support for legislative and policy framework. So we know, for example, that there's been a lot in Latin America over the past couple of years in terms of registries, partly because some of those particular integrated systems were underpinned by a legislative framework, laws that supported, whether you're talking about Chile, whether you're talking about Brazil and many other countries. The other part, which I think is slightly different for SP sector, is the institutional arrangements. We've got multiple departments, ministries, implementing social protection. So you don't, in an ideal world, you'd want to have one governance institution responsible for delivering social protection, because from a leadership, from a coordination, it makes things a bit easier. And of course, sometimes there are political economy issues. There are typically some worries about who will have that particular control of the information system agenda, who will have control in terms of the data. So these are some of the hindrances that I see when it comes to moving forward the agenda. They have to be overcome. And then finally, what I see is with open source, someone told me, well, why is it sometimes open source, people confuse with open source being free. So people think, well, if it's free, whom am I holding accountable in terms of the actual implementation? If the software is not functioning as it is, I want to see, for example, a supplier, a contractor at the end of on the other side, who has a contractual obligation to deliver. Of course, you can overcome some of these. There are quite a number of open source tools that suppliers can quickly customize if they are appropriate for that particular situation and implement. So I think that those are some of the challenges. The other part is social assistance generally has got quite a lot of changes in terms of the business requirements. Social insurance is slightly different. You tend to have a business process that starts off with registration of members, contributions, and also disbursement of funds. While social assistance, you've got a plethora of schemes that work with that, with differences in terms of even the data that is collected. A targeted program versus universal collects different kinds of data sets. So whereas we're saying, for example, we are agreeing on the taxonomy, we would need to be able to have a truly open source system. We need a system that is fully configurable. It means modular. It means it's configurable, every element. You can add every field You can create a workflow for that particular system. And more importantly, you need something that can also, in terms of thinking of for performance, it's been designed for scale. It's not something that works for only 100,000 beneficiaries. When you talk about millions, say, for example, say in Pakistan or India, it should be able to work for that particular thing. But I think it's great that this particular conversation is happening now. We are very excited that this dialogue is going on. But I think ultimately we would need to have critical mass of actors working in this particular space to have something that is truly functional. The first part I would see is you would need something that almost like supports 90% of business processes within the social protection delivery chain to say that that's something that can be used. And then ultimately, there would be need for support among multiple implementers, government agencies, and others for a while until you have a critical mass of people who are fully using it. The same way, for example, we have the DHIS within the health sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Lots of good points there and many that we need to follow up on. And I'm glad you raised the point of the critical mass, which I think will be important even for the Convergence initiative as we begin defining standards, right? It will need to cover at least 90% of the cases, as you mentioned. So thanks for that. And some of the worries that you mentioned around data, so on and so forth, it'll also be good to have another conversation later on how much of this is a perceived sense of risk that can be carefully dealt with through patient engagement with the government counterparts. I know we are running late, but I want to give sort of 2 minutes to make his remarks, and then we'll quickly wrap up in 3 minutes. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Madhumita. No, just wanted to touch on the issues that Richard was talking about on on open source. These are quite valid points, but one of the things and one of the ways we can really get towards solving these issues is really thinking about the other, I would even say more important part than the open source software is around the community, right? So open source software, DHIS2, Mozilla Firefox, all these softwares are successful as open source tools, not because of how good the software is, but how good the community is. And we really, as donors, as implementers, as users of open source tools, we really need to think about how we can invest in and make these communities stronger. And then these communities themselves will start advocating for the tools. Then, the new countries who want to use it, they can rely on the community of peers of other countries who've used it to look for answers. Like they can tell them about how data security works and all these issues. And new functionalities can also come from the community. They will know what features can work, cannot work, because practitioners from all over the world know much more than us sitting in an office somewhere. So I really think that when we talk about open source, we should not forget to talk about the community and the importance of it and the need for investing in developing such a community, because without that, open source is just software being published on GitHub and no one using it, right? So I just wanted to highlight that for open source to succeed, for reusing code, for all the principles that we're talking about, building a community around software and open source technologies is absolutely key. Thank you.
Thanks, Saurav. And that's a great point to end the session on, because I was reflecting on how open source software has been such a bottom-up process, and in contrast, international development is such a top-down process. And maybe today's discussion is a conversation starter around changing some of that, because as Rodrigo remarked in the beginning, digitalization is a force that cannot be stopped, right? So if you're not willing to change yourselves now, it is going to impose on you at a later stage at a much higher cost. Thanks everyone for this very, very refreshing, candid discussion today. I'm glad to be joined by so many peers with such great grounded experience and self-awareness. I'm sure we get where we aspire to get. As I said, today is just a conversation starter, and hopefully we continue this conversation going forward. With that, I hand over to Dominique to wrap up in 2 minutes with the next steps.
Yeah, so thanks. It's a pleasure for me to give you the closing remarks. We are a little bit over time, so I try to hurry up. First of all, thanks a lot for this event. It was a great and important discussion, not only for the social protection sector, also for other ones. But I would like to thank all the speakers and volunteers who participated in our fishbowl discussion today. I'd also like to thank the attendees for coming and contributing insightful comments and questions. I'd particularly like to thank Charlie, Julian, Saurav, Rodrigo, Thomas, Abbott, Veronica, Sengcheng, Richard, and Madhumita for the moderation and facilitation, and the Digital Impact Alliance for their support during the process of the report. Second, as mentioned earlier by Veronica, we will have a public review phase to reflect on the different outputs of the Digital Convergence Initiative. We saw some points in the chat box. You can address these online in the public review phase. The report will be online available on the Digital Convergence Initiative website, as long with the presentation resources. We encourage you to share your thoughts and comments via the documents review feature on Google Docs. Please note, this will be available until the 19th of May. And last but not least, I'd also like to take this opportunity to let you know that we'll be hosting the third dialogue series focused on Turkey's experience building an integrated social assistance system. This event will take place on the 18th of May. To register for this event, please follow the event links, which will be shared in the coming days on our website, social media, via email, and on socialprotection.org. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.